In this lecture, I plan to begin with the end of the story of Hatshepsut, the mystery of what happened to her, and the eradication of her images. Who was responsible? It may not have been the person almost everyone today thinks it was. I will then discuss her stepson, Menkaure, who, after 22 years of awaiting his opportunity in the wings of the palace, went on to become Thutmose III, Egypt's greatest military pharaoh, and how his clever stratagem at Megiddo in northern Palestine at the very beginning of his reign established his reputation as a brave and resourceful commander. Then we will return to the Valley of the Kings to take a look at the rather unexpected nature of the artwork in his remarkable tomb. The remainder of the lecture will be taken up by a discussion of the fabulous Pylon Temples, one of Egypt's most ubiquitous architectural forms, and I will reveal what few people today realize about them, how the cosmos itself was born from their form with every new day. As far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, this earth and the cosmos as they knew it would cease to exist if it wasn't for the ceremonies performed within the Holy of Holies every day. So some eye-opening information for those who love Egypt. So let's just jump right in with a final look at our favorite female pharaoh. Some of the more observant ones among you may have noticed that my wife has seemingly discovered the secret of eternal life. And so stay tuned and maybe you'll discover what that secret is also. Anyway, let's continue with our story of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Is this a story of palace intrigue and revenge? Well, let's talk about the rest of the story. So for those who are champions of the stepson Menkaure, who was supposedly suppressed and kept from claiming his rightful place on the throne for all of his young life, was Hatshepsut the evil stepmother, and was Menkaure the repressed stepson? After Hatshepsut's death, the stepson, Menkaure, does become the pharaoh as Thutmose III. It only took him 22 years to get there, waiting for his mother's passing before he could assume his rightful place on the throne of Egypt. We know that her images and her cartouches were erased after her death. Her name not included in the king's list at Abydos, so it's as though she never ruled, and her obelisks were walled up. So, as I mentioned last time, somebody didn't like her very much, and it would seem obvious who that person was. So did Thutmose III finally get his revenge on her for usurping his crown for so long? Well, certainly a romantic and popularly held possibility. Almost every source that you consult about this era of time places the blame on Thutmose III, and it certainly seems to make some sense that he wanted to get his revenge on this domineering woman that prevented him from becoming the pharaoh that he was meant to be, that his lineage declared him to be. But quite frankly, not all of the evidence seems to support that conclusion. For example, she made him chief of her armies. He was a general in charge of her military forces, could have overthrown her at any time that he wanted to. And who would stop him? He built his own mortuary temple right next to hers, cheek to jowl. So here we've seen Mentuhotep's temple, as we've seen before, Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, and right there, right next to it, between the two, is the mortuary temple of Thutmose III. Now, that seems very strange for someone to build his mortuary temple there, right next to the temple of someone whom he despised. He's going to be worshipped next to this despicable woman who suppressed him for the rest of eternity? Begs a question there of whether that makes any sense or not. Now, I did a little bit of research yesterday on these temples, and I came across a very interesting site by a company called Altair 4 that specializes in recreating in 3D ancient structures, and I thought this was a rather interesting representation of those three temples, Hatshepsut's, Mentuhotep, and Thutmose III. So another thing that many people are not aware of is that when you hear about the erasing of her images and that sort of thing, you think that, well, as soon as the rightful king came to the throne, he immediately destroyed her temple and erased her images and that sort of thing. But quite frankly, those inscriptions were not erased until 20 years after her death. And that occurred during the co-regency of Thutmose III's son, a young man by the name of Amenhotep II. So by that time, Thutmose III himself was an old man, only a few years before his death. Why did he wait so long? If he was going to get his revenge, why wait so long to do that? Well, in my opinion, it seems as though it was his son, this co-regent, that instigated the erasure of these images and evidence of her rule, because he didn't want it known, seemingly, that it was possible for a woman to rule successfully. In other words, he's a misogynist. He despises womankind for whatever reason. And this was perhaps his way of preventing the rise of a future female ruler in the royal line, because if he left these evidences of a successful rule by a female, maybe that would suggest that other females were capable of ruling in the future, which he wanted to suppress. An indication of that is that even for his own wives, typically royal wives held certain powerful titles. And when he became pharaoh, he eliminated those titles and the official roles of his own royal wives. So, an Egyptian misogynist who did not want to set a precedent that perhaps a female could rule successfully? Well, possibly. I tend to subscribe to that theory more than the idea of Thutmose III getting revenge finally after 20 years, getting revenge on his evil stepmother. So that's my opinion, at least. I also wanted to show you a rather interesting fact about this temple of Hatshepsut, this mortuary temple. So again, this aerial view, I rather like this aerial view because it shows the ridge of the cliffs coming down. The Valley of the Kings is over here, as you know. Then this ridge that separates them. And here in this cove of the cliffs, I didn't realize it was quite so deeply inset, and then some of it carved even further back into the cliffs here, is the complex of those three temples. And then to see how they would have looked originally, kind of interesting in my opinion. That's why I like doing 3D reconstructions, because it gives us a better idea of these societies that we're studying, and of which we find just so much in ruins today. Now Thutmose III. In Hatshepsut's 22nd regnal year she dies, as we talked about before, and Thutmose III became pharaoh at last. Now, Hatshepsut may have had him marry her daughter Neferura at some point, either while he was prince or maybe after he became pharaoh. It's a little unclear there. But if he did, and in order to make stronger ties between them perhaps, but if he did, Neferura apparently dies young, because any evidence of her, records of her, disappears relatively soon. But Thutmose was to go on to become Egypt's greatest military pharaoh. We can see evidence of that here in this relief on the temple wall at Medinet Habu, a temple near the delta, where we can see Thutmose III in the striking pose with his hand full of the top knots of his enemies. You can see a multitude of enemies forced to their knees before him here on in this relief. So the fact that he was to become Egypt's greatest military pharaoh is evidenced by the fact that he conducted 17 military campaigns in 18 years during the first portion of his reign. So virtually every year it would take the armies and go out and reassert Egyptian dominance over the territories around them. So it was under him that Egypt was able to extend its hegemony from Nubia all the way to Mesopotamia. So I talked earlier about Thutmose I, his grandfather, who created Egypt's first empire that we showed was not an empire at all, but just an area of influence or a hegemony, where a state exercises its influence over its neighbors, militarily and socially, politically, economically, that sort of thing. And that's what Egypt is doing here. And so he extends Egypt's hegemony far beyond what his grandfather had done, all the way up into the middle of Iraq here, seemingly all the way down perhaps to the end of the Red Sea. Difficult to know exactly, but in any case, he expands Egypt's area of influence significantly. In fact, under him, war became an Egyptian state policy. And by that I mean that it was a way that Egypt used to keep income flowing in to the treasuries, to the state coffers every year. So basically, victory in battle then over his neighbors forced those nations to pay yearly tribute to Egypt and kept the coffers overflowing. Now he's able to do that, as we've talked about before, because he can maintain a standing army that is always ready to go out on campaign. And this is because of the rich agricultural production of the valley. You can keep an army in arms year-round, unlike their neighbors that have to disband their armies during the harvest season, during the planting seasons, and so on. And then when the campaigning season came around, a particular time of year, they'd gather the armies together and go out on campaigns or whatever. But Egypt could do that basically anytime they wanted to. So here is an example of one of reasons why Thutmose was considered to be such a great military commander. In the very second year of his reign, he engages in a military campaign called the Megiddo campaign, in which he brings the territories of the Canaanites back under his control. Because it was in the very second year of his reign that Canaanite tribes and kingdoms up in northern Palestine basically banded together and revolted against Egyptian control. So this was a dangerous precedent to set, because that area of the Near East, this was the gateway to the north basically, to lucrative trade routes and so on, and influence, and Thutmose III could not allow this to happen. And so this coalition rebels against Egyptian control at a place called Megiddo. So Thutmose gathers together his army and marches north in an unprecedentedly short period of time to Megiddo in order to quell the rebellion. So here's an image of Megiddo. It is a highly fortified citadel atop a hill here in elevation. You can see in this model how powerfully fortified it was. And so you wouldn't want to attack the city itself. That'd be very difficult, but to fight out on these plains, that's a sort of tactic that you'd want to be able to use. Now Megiddo is interesting, both from, just historical evidences and from biblical evidences in the Old Testament. Megiddo was an important city because it stood right on the main gateway to the north. In fact, it was the main gateway to the trade routes to the north, into Mesopotamia. As such, it was a site of many battles, and so had gained a real reputation during the time of the ancient world. In fact, excavations here have shown as many as 20 layers of rebuilding. In other words, building, destruction, like we talked about earlier in the term here. The city has been destroyed 20 different times and rebuilt. And the reason for that is because of the very strategic position that it occupied in northern Palestine. So it is from its name that we get the term Armageddon that we read about in the New Testament. Armageddon basically means mountain of Megiddo. And of course, the association with the New Testament is that in the book of Revelations, this is the site that John the Revelator says, will be the site of the battle of the last days, Armageddon. In any case, here's a Google Earth map of the site, the region around Megiddo, in order to kind of demonstrate this daring strategy that Thutmose III put into place right in the very earliest years of his reign, establishing himself as a great military commander. So the Egyptian camp, as Thutmose brings his army north, they settle in this area somewhere here in the area of that circle. Now Megiddo is here on its mountain top. Now you can't tell from this image very well, but these green areas here is a mountain ridge that runs along here and then kind of fades away down in here into flat plains. So if you want to attack Megiddo, there's two routes that Thutmose could have taken. There's one that passes just east of Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is one of the highest mountains in Palestine. And so he could have taken the northern route through this valley and attacked Megiddo in that way. Or he could have gone by the southern route and attacked this way through these flat plains. Of course, the Canaanites understood that, and so they established blocking forces in both of those areas. But instead of taking either one of those routes, which would be the expected tactic, Thutmose decides to try a very daring stratagem that could have ended in disaster if it had not worked. And so what he determined to do was to use a third route that no one expected that he would use. And no one expected that because it involved the use of a valley that was so narrow that, according to his own chroniclers, in order to pass the army through that valley, it had to go horse after horse, man after man. This is called the Aruna Pass, which is located right there on our map. So that's the route that he decides to take against all expectations. Nobody thought anyone would be foolish enough to try to take an army through this pass. So I did a little research on this just to find out what the pass was like, and let me show you where the pass is and why the chronicler says that the army had to pass through it silently in the middle of the night, horse after horse and man after man. So let's fly down here and take a look at the site. So they're coming up this way, and there's Megiddo up there. So let's just take a look at it here as we go down to ground level and make our way through the valley. You can see how very narrow it is. Try to take an entire army through here. It was foolishness of the utmost type. If the Canaanites had suspected that he was trying to do that, it would have been disaster. But once he gets through the valley where this road is running today and out onto the flat plains, then he has access to Megiddo, there on its hilltop, and the Canaanite forces around it. Now, by taking this surprise route through the middle of the night and springing his attack on the city the next day, he wins a great victory, totally unexpected victory, in only the second year of his rule, thereby establishing himself as a bold and brave and very resourceful leader that's willing to take chances in order to turn the tables on his enemies. Now he goes on to rule for 30 years, very successful reign, plus the 22 that he served as a prince under Hatshepsut. Now eventually, of course, he's going to die as a very old man. And so let's return back to the Valley of the Kings and take a look at his tomb. It's a quite remarkable tomb, unexpected in several ways. So here's an image of his mummy as we have it today, and another image of the Valley of the Kings. Now let me just remind you of where the tombs were that have been built so far up to this point in the Valley of the Kings. So Thutmose I, there along those eastern cliffs. And then his son, Thutmose II, down toward the southern end of the valley. Then, of course, Hatshepsut, as you know, occupies the same tomb, extends and enlarges the tomb of Thutmose I and occupies that tomb. Now for Thutmose III, his tomb is there even further south than Thutmose II. So this is a very interesting location. It's at the end of a very narrow canyon right here. So let me show you some images of that. This is the way that it looks today with tourist access to it, of course. And you can see the people climbing the stairs and the ladder here to get to the canyon floor. Now this is a very narrow box canyon. That's a dead end with narrow walls on each side. Now, years ago when I went to Egypt with my tour that I've talked about before, we were able to visit this particular tomb, and it was rather interesting to see it. And so we walked down the canyon floor and came to the entrance, like you see here, and you can see how narrow the canyon is in the entrance there. And then enter into the entrance. And you enter into a corridor and an arrangement of rooms is very similar to that tomb, that 3D model that I showed you earlier. So we enter in, and eventually you come to the burial chamber in which the sarcophagus has been left for viewing. The thing that's interesting about the sarcophagus is that it is in the shape of a cartouche, that royal symbol. Similar, of course, to the one that Hatshepsut had given to her companion, Sennemut. Now, before we take a look at the chamber here, just let me pause for a moment to describe an experience that I had when we visited this tomb. So you proceed through the corridors similar to that tomb that I showed you with the catchment pit and the little wooden bridge now that crosses the pit. Enter into a large kind of antechamber sort of structure. In the corner of it, in the floor of the antechamber, was an opening that led down to the next level where the burial chamber was. So we go down to the burial chamber, and the entire burial chamber is in the shape of a cartouche as well. It isn't just the sarcophagus itself, but the whole chamber. This is not very typical, first of all, so an unusual feature here. But in any case, we were in a group of about 12 or 15 visitors along with our tour guide. And he takes us in and begins talking to us about Egypt and tombs and burials and so on, talking to us about the tomb, when all of a sudden the lights went out. Now everybody, of course, was surprised by that and not expecting it, certainly. It wasn't deliberate, it was just accidental. And our tour director says, everybody remain calm, don't get excited. This happens every so often in Egypt. You know, not all that, the electricity grid work and not all that reliable in those days at least. Wonder whether it's any better today, but in any case, he says, just don't walk around much here because it was in total darkness. This was well before the days of cell phones and things like that, and so no one had any light, any artificial light. So he just said, don't go walking around bumping into stuff. The lights will come on in a few minutes, and so let's just wait patiently until they do. Can't make our way back out. It'd be too difficult to try to negotiate through the corridors in the dark, so just wait here. So the thing that was interesting to me, though, is that at last I realized, really for the first time, what these tombs were really meant to be like in ancient Egypt. We go in and take a visit these tombs today. They're all fully illuminated with artificial lights. You can see all the carvings, the reliefs, the sarcophagus, the paintings and carvings on the walls, all these kinds of things like we've talked about before. But keep in mind that none of that was ever intended to be seen by living eye once the tomb was sealed up. It was all in total darkness. All of those beautiful paintings and carvings and decorations, never intended to be seen by the human eye once the pharaoh was sealed into his sarcophagus for eternity. So it really made a powerful impression upon me as to all the work that was done in these tombs was never meant to be seen. Remember all those beautiful paintings that we saw last time in those tomb decorations? It was from a much later period, time of Ramses II, but none of that was ever intended to be seen once it was made. So again, What would that be like for artists today if once their beautiful, hard work was sealed away and never to be seen ever again by anyone? Wouldn't be much incentive, right, to be an artist today. Instead, we take the artwork and put it out on walls in very public places and in order to promote ourselves and to brag about how great we are as artists and those kinds of things. But it's not the case for the artists in ancient Egypt. They were working in the service of a pharaoh, god, king, and all of their hard labor was meant just to serve him in his eternal existence. Different kind of mindset for art than what we have today. In any case, as we look at our image here of the burial chamber, can't see that it's in a cartouche shape, but you get some idea of the curvature here, and certainly kind of repeats the shape of the sarcophagus. Notice that the ceiling is painted in blue, as is typical, with the gold stars, and then paintings on the walls. But notice they don't seem to be quite as colorful as the paintings that we have seen so far. This is the biggest surprise about the tomb of Thutmose III. This is the first burial chamber to be fully painted. Now keep in mind that one that we saw last time, that's from a much later period where it was even more completely decorated than this one. But this is the first burial chamber to be fully painted, but no reliefs on the walls. These are just paintwork on the walls. There's no relief that's then colored in like before. And the figure work itself is very unusual. So this is typical of the type of figure work that we're used to, right? We see this as being the traditional way that Egyptian figures are painted and decoration is executed. But this is the figure work in Thutmose III's tomb. Totally unexpected. It seems like something almost from the modern world. As we look at it closer, look at how simplistic and spare and just pure line quality that the artist here is employing. And it isn't just in the figures, but also the hieroglyphs are the same kind of shorthand style. But it's interesting to me that the artist seems to be breaking with, obviously is breaking with that tradition of figure work and begs the question as to why, but I don't know that we have any answer to that. But look how beautifully depicted are in this very simplistic, direct, and abstract form how the artist is capturing the essence so beautifully of the figures that he's working with here. So it's a very unusual kind of shorthand style of Egyptian figure work. Are we looking at an Egyptian Picasso here, perhaps? Or maybe even better, an Egyptian Matisse? Who knows, but I find this kind of artwork to be really quite fascinating given the nature of Egyptian figure work up to this point. How the artist, with just a few strokes of the brush, is able to capture the essence of these figures and make them totally recognizable in terms of what gods and figures they represent. So just a sweep of the brush captures the essence in such a spare, simple, direct expression of form that I find it rather unexpected and fascinating for this period of time. So that's the nature of the artwork at Thutmose III's tomb. Begs the question of why it looks this way, where the inspiration comes from, and so on, but I don't know that we will ever know the answers to those questions. All right, now I'd like to turn our attention to temples, one of the most ubiquitous of Egyptian artifacts that remains in modern-day Egypt today. There were three types of temples. Now these temples littered the valley of the Nile River from north to south, very common in those days. We only see a few of them that still remain in good condition today, but there would have been many, many temples all along the entire valley for the most part. And there were typically three types. The famous Pylon Temple, what we call the Pylon Temple today, mortuary temples like we've seen with Hatshepsut, and shrines. Now this is a very famous shrine down south, right on the borders with Nubia, shrine built at the command of Ramses II, and really a magnificent design and concept. So what we want to focus on now are the Pylon temples. Now, pylon is a Greek word meaning gate, and we apply it to these temples today to describe them because of these huge entrance gates that stand out on the front. Now remember, there would have been two obelisks standing in front of the temple here, of which one only remains, obviously. I think this photograph gives a pretty good feeling for the nature of these temples. They were more than just buildings where people went to worship. In fact, quite frankly, people were not allowed in these temples. These were not public venues. These were structures that were reserved for the pharaoh. Of course, the pharaoh couldn't attend at every temple, and so he had a whole cadre of priests that would be in charge of these temples. But the general public, even nobility, according to some sources, were not allowed into these buildings. The whole structure was created in order to serve the gods and to serve the survival of the world, quite frankly. So let's talk a little bit about that. These temples represented a mirror of the cosmos. Now, this is one of the concepts that I think modern day people have the hardest time trying to understand because we're so scientifically oriented that the concept of what the temple meant to the Egyptian kind of eludes us. It's hard for us to understand how the Egyptian considered these places to be. We think of a church, a temple, or a religious structure that you go in and you do your particular kind of worship or ritual or whatever, and then leave again and give it no more thought during the day. But these were not meant for that. There was a certain amount of worship that went on here based on what the priests would do, not the people themselves, but the priests. But they had a far deeper and more important meaning than that to the ancient Egyptian. So their purpose really was threefold. One, certainly, to worship the gods. So we're looking here at the facade of the Temple of Karnak, that was dedicated to the god Amun or Amun-Re. So it was meant as a place to worship the gods, but also it was to ensure the survival of Horus. Now remember, Horus is the sun god. We see him in a physical representation every day as the sun, traversing the sky from east to west, and then repeating that cycle over and over throughout eternity. Now the thing is that once the sun/Horus arrived at the west, he had to go beneath the earth, beneath the world, and travel on what the Egyptians called his perilous journey in order to reemerge once again the next day on the eastern horizon so that the day could proceed once again in its prescribed eternal cycle. So these temples were built largely to ensure the survival of Horus on that perilous journey through the underworld, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And in connection with that, in some indescribable, sort of indefinable way, these temples transformed themselves into the new cosmos with each day. Now this is the part that we Westerners cannot understand, because we know perfectly well that they can't do that. But for the Egyptian, it wasn't a question of logic and rationality. For them, in some way, the very temple itself and the form of it was transformed, transmogrified, in a sense, into the cosmos. And so, as a consequence, the form of the temple was very deliberate. There was nothing intuitive or spontaneous about the structure and form of the temple, because it had to contain the elements of the creation myth. I'm going to review the creation myth next to remind you of what that was all about, at least a different version of the creation myth, and see how these temples contain the elements within their form of that myth. And because they did contain the elements of the creation myth, they thereby became the creation with each new day. So, a review of the creation myth. As you know, in the beginning, all was chaos and danger and darkness, and water covered the whole earth, right? At some point, though, out of that chaos, which was ruled over by a creature of chaos called Apophis, who's going to show up in our tale here in just a moment, out of that water arose the primordial mound. Now this is the same as in that other creation myth that I told you, where next Atum, the self-created god, appears on the mound and begins to generate life. In this version of the myth, it isn't Atum, but rather it is a papyrus plant, interestingly enough, that grows up out of the ground on the mound, and from the heavens, Horus, the sun god, in the form of a hawk, flies out of the heavens and perches on the plant. Now remember, all around is chaos and darkness and roaring seas and, danger all around. And Horus flies down out of the heavens, perches on the plant as a place of safety. Now around him, in order to protect him, according to the myth, a sanctuary of papyrus reeds grows up around the original papyrus and Horus to protect him from the danger of the chaos. And then, in order to protect that sanctuary, a thick wall of papyrus reeds grows up around the sanctuary to protect it from the danger. And then from within that sanctuary, Horus creates all life, and all life emerges from the sanctuary. Now, the thing that's interesting about this story is that the temples are meant to imitate that story and contain within their form the essence of that creation myth. So let's take a look first here at the perilous journey, and then we'll talk about how the temples are used to ensure Horus's successful journey through the underworld. So Horus, the sun god, in the form of the sun, traverses the sky each day and has done so from time immemorial, traveling from the eastern horizon to the western horizon. Now, when he arrives at the western horizon, he must pass over the cosmic mountains that were placed there on each horizon, west and east. These cosmic mountains were placed there on the edges of the earth in order to prevent innocent or unsuspecting humans from being able to pass into the underworld. Okay, so he has to pass the cosmic mountain on the western horizon in order to enter into the underworld. Okay, so he descends into the underworld on the western horizon with each setting sun. Now, he must pass through the underworld eastward and arrive on the eastern horizon, pass over that cosmic mountain, and rise once again into the sky as the sun to perform his daily passage over the earth. So he must survive the journey through the underworld. And this is a very dangerous journey because it's perilous in many ways, especially because it is ruled over by Apophis, the creature of chaos that ruled before creation. But he must make that journey successfully every day so that the cosmos can be reborn in the form of the sun and the universe with the next morning. So it's a very perilous, circuitous path that he must take to the eastern horizon where the cosmic mountain there awaits his passage. Now, as I said, the underworld, what makes it perilous for him is that Apophis, this creature of chaos, he's waiting, he's lurking down in the darkness of the underworld, and his intent is to destroy Horus during this journey, thus preventing the cosmos from being reborn on the next day and allowing everything to return to the chaos that had existed before creation. So Horus descends into the underworld on the western horizon and must confront this great Apophis, who the Egyptians portray in the form of this great serpent. And so Horus navigates his way through the underworld and to the eastern horizon. Now, one of the main purposes of the temple is to assure his survival through the rituals that are performed in the temple. So it helps him to survive the assault of Apophis and allows the rebirth of the cosmos each morning. So here's a little video that I've gotten off the internet that shows priests going back into the Holy of Holies of the temple, back at the far reaches of the temple in order to perform their offerings each day, leaving a bowl of fruit or other foods before the goddess or god, and then do washing and anointing and repainting the coal, refreshing the coal makeup around the eyes of the deity that is there. In this case, it happens to be a female deity, but if it was Amun, the same thing would occur at the temple of Karnak, for example. Now, the idea is that some 4 times a day, those priests would perform those rituals at prescribed times during the day. They would pass through the temple into the far reaches of the back of the temple, open up the doors to the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary, the handles of which had been tied shut with ropes. They would enter into the sanctuary, leave the offerings for the deity, wash and anoint, dress with new fresh linen, the statue that was sitting on the solar boat that was on the altar that was there. I'll show you a little reconstruction of that in a little bit later here. And then they would leave the offerings, exit the room according to the few records that we have of what went on there, close the doors, retie the intricate knots on the handles, leave the temple, come back at the next time of ritual, prescribed period of day, untie the knotwork, open the door, go in, perform the rituals all over again, and then leave, taking with them the original offering, the bowl of fruit or whatever. Now, and then they would go off and have lunch and eat the offering. This was one of the advantages, one of the perks of being a priest in the ancient world, whether it was Egyptian or any other culture. One of the misconceptions that modern day people have about the ancient world is that they ate lots of meat. This is not true. They ate very little meat, unless you're maybe talking about the barbaric Germans up in northern Germany or something. But for the most part, people in the ancient world did not kill their cattle to eat them. These were precious possessions that they didn't just kill to eat. It was a source of their wealth in large measure. But because they were precious, these were oftentimes objects of sacrifice to the gods. And so when you went to the Jerusalem temple, for example, in Judea, on day of Passover or whatever, you'd take your offering to the temple, whether it be a calf, a dove, a heifer, something that was of value to you, and you would offer that to the god. The priest would then sacrifice the bull, the calf, the heifer, whatever it was, to the god, cut it up, put it on the altar and burn it. It would be burned so that the essence of the sacrifice could rise to the heavens where God could receive it. But that left the meat on the altar, right? And so some of the best parts of that meat would be preserved. Some of it would be given back to the person that was offering the sacrifice as kind of a reward for his offering. He could take that back to his family and they'd have meat that night. And that might be the only time during the entire year where they might have some meat to eat. But the priests had their portion as well. So part of that meat sacrifice would go to the priest. Or if it was vegetables or fruit or wine or whatever it was, that would go to the priest. And that was part of their perks for being a priest, is that they got that food every day, as opposed to the ordinary citizen that only got it once or twice a year at most. So in any case, talking about the Egyptian priests, they'd take that food, they'd consume it, they'd eat it, as part of their privilege as a priest, but they understood that the god to whom they had given the offering had already consumed the essence of it. And so they, it wasn't like they were taking away from the god. They knew that the god couldn't eat it physically, but they would consume its essence, and then they would take the physical food away and eat it for lunch or whatever. Okay, so they performed that ritual several times a day, 3 to 4 times a day, according to the records. And it was the rituals that they performed in that Holy of Holies that allowed Horus's survival as he passed through the underworld every day, every night, so that he could be reborn on the eastern horizon the next day. And with that rebirth, the rebirth of the cosmos itself. So that's one of the purposes that the temple served. Now, all temples were of a similar design. So here's a Google Earth image to just show you the type of look of a pylon temple. And they all had those very similar kind of elements that you see there. So here's my recreation so we can get a better idea of what the form of the temple was, the different parts of it, and how those all related to the creation story, so that in some inscrutable sort of way, indefinable to the Western mind sort of way, the temple could become the cosmos with each new day. So here's my turntable, give you an idea of the way the temple looked in its entirety. Now, the intention of these buildings wasn't just for people to go in and worship and then go back out, every Sunday or whatever. It's not that sort of thing like I've already stated. The intention of these buildings was to provide a sacred venue in which to conduct those rituals that protected Horus and ensure the rebirth of the cosmos. Now, the intention originally was that the Pharaoh was the person that would perform these rituals, because he's God on earth. That's part of what he does. It's part of what his duty is to perform these rituals as God on earth, a representation of the earthly Horus, so to speak. But there are many temples, and the Pharaoh could not be at all of those temples. And so he appointed a high priest that would stand in as proxy, and then his entourage of priests that would perform the duties of the temple. And so those are the individuals that would perform these rituals every day in these temples. I'm sure the Pharaoh did his part when he could, when he wasn't out on campaign, or in the harem with his concubines or whatever. But in any case, the rituals were performed by this very increasingly large and powerful cadre of priests. And we'll talk more about that powerful priestly influence within Egyptian society and government later when we talk about the Amarna period. In any case, that's what the temples was for. Now let's just describe the form of the temple here. So a little walkthrough. So you got the pylon gate, and again the pylon entrance I should say, so I can't say pylon gate because that's gate, since the word pylon means gate. But in any case, you've got the pylon gate here. And here's the fairly well-preserved one. And then beyond that, you got the temenos, that enclosing wall. And then inside, just beyond the gate, is this open court that is framed by columns in a peristyle type court that's partially covered for shade. And here you see that court and columns, surviving columns of a peristyle walkway. Then beyond that, the so-called hypostyle hall, the first enclosed portion of the temple. And here you see some columns from inside the hypostyle hall that held the roof up, and we'll see my model of that in more detail in just a minute. And so you can see here in this image, we've got columns and walls and piers all covered with carvings of various subjects, and we'll talk more about what those carvings were there for later. And then finally, in the very back of the temple, the furthest removed from the entrance, is the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. And so what we see here is a small room inside this area, and that's the sanctuary. Then around it are these storage rooms. used for various purposes. Now notice there's no windows anywhere in this area. Of course, it would be covered over with the roof. So inside here was total dark until the priests would go in with their offerings, open the doors and go in with their offerings. Otherwise, this was in a very small, cramped, completely dark area of the temple. Okay, so here we see a modern-day view of the passage through the hypostyle hall and back into the sanctuary area. And again, misleading because of how brightly illuminated everything is today. Wouldn't have been that way in those days. So then here we see the remains of a sanctuary at the Temple of Karnak as it exists today. A little altar in there that the statue would sit on with his solar boat. So here's a cutaway view of the temple so that we can see better how the various parts related to that creation story. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is that temples, whenever possible, are organized from west to east. So this is the west, this is the east. Sanctuary is in the west, the direction of death, right, of the setting sun. The open court and pylon gates are in the east, the direction of life, all right? So they're organized that way very deliberately from west to east, from, in a sense, from death to life. So that was the way the temples are organized was a very deliberate, conscious choice. So we're going from darkness to light. Darkness is death, light is life. Now they're always aligned axially. In other words, they don't go at angles. I mean, we'll see later on a temple that deliberately goes at an angle, but we'll have to explain why that's the case. Because temples typically are aligned axially along a straight line from the gateway to the sanctuary. And that represents symbolically the straight and narrow way through life. Okay, so let's look at the parts here. So the symbolism and meaning of the various parts of the temple. So the pylon gate. The pylon gate, as you look at it here, you can see it has a very distinctive shape with sloping sides. That's because that pylon gate is intended to represent symbolically those cosmic mountains that stood at either edge of the world, east and west. And so these were those mountains that prevented humans from being able to pass unintentionally or deliberately even into the underworld. So the shape of them is significant. So the pylon gate. Now remember, the pylon gate is something beyond which the public could not go. All right. Then you've got the temenos wall, and of course that temenos wall surrounding the complex that represents that barrier of reeds that grew up in that creation story to protect the sanctuary, which it does here. It separates everything within the precincts of the temple from everything on the outside. Okay, so then a cutaway view to see some more elements here. Notice that as we proceed back from the pylon gate back to the sanctuary, the most important part of the temple, of course, is the Holy of Holies or the sanctuary. As we proceed back, it's kind of imperceptible, but if you look at it carefully, you can see that each section is higher than the section before. You got this little ramp that leads up to the next section, then a ramp that leads up to the next section, and a ramp and so on, all the way back to the back. That's deliberate. That indicates the rise of the primordial mound out of the seas of chaos in the creation story. So that part represents that aspect of the creation story. So not only does the floor level rise here, but notice that the ceiling level lowers. So as you go further and further back, it gets smaller and smaller and more cramped and darker until back here with no windows, you're in total blackness in the sanctuary, and that's very deliberate design choice. So then you've got the sanctuary there in the back portions, and here again is the remains of the sanctuary at Karnak. Now again, can't overemphasize the fact that this is in total darkness. And what does that darkness represent? We'll do a cutaway view here to show you what's inside. You've got this some type of small shrine in here. Then another small shrine type altar, inside of which would be the solar boat, like what Horus would ride on across the skies. And then the statue of Horus or the deity would be in that solar boat. It's got handles here, so could be removed from the sanctuary and carried around on the periodic processionals that happen throughout the year. So you got the rising ramp here leading up to the sanctuary, and I put my little geometric guy in there just to give you an idea of the scale. So it's a small space and no openings, no windows. So this represented that original sanctuary of reeds that grew up around the papyrus plant that Horus came and perched on. And so we see here Horus perched on his altar in the same manner. Now this represented the womb of life, because this is the sanctuary, the area from which all life proceeded at the behest of Horus. So the sanctuary represents the womb of life also. And the darkness in which it is kept and shrouded represents both the womb of life at the beginning before light enters into a person's life, right? The darkness of the womb, as well as the darkness of the underworld and of creation before the cosmos is created in all its glory with the sun that provides light. So the sanctuary symbolized all those things in its design and creation. Now, as you moved from the realm of death or darkness toward the world of life or light, you leave the sanctuary and move toward the east. So even though when you're entering a temple, you enter from the east and move westward, in reality, the orientation is from the sanctuary to the open court, in terms of sequence of the evolution of creation. And so we enter next into the hypostyle hall. All right, so let's take a look at the hypostyle hall here in greater detail. As you move in that evolutionary journey from darkness to light through creation of life, you move from small, cramped, dark quarters to greater openness and light as you move into the hypostyle hall. So let me show you this little recreation here, this little animated clip that I made to give you an idea of the scale of the hypostyle hall at Karnak. Now, Karnak was the greatest temple of Egypt and perhaps of the entire world at that time. And I'll show you some recreation of a model of Karnak at the end of our lecture here. But let me just pull back here and show you this hall. Okay, 60,000 square feet, filled full of these columns that held up the roof. Now notice some of them are taller than others in order to create a zone right through here that I'll show you in just a moment that contained windows, a little bit of light filtering into the hall. But you got this vast forest of columns that held up the roof. And you can see from the guy standing there the scale at Karnak. Here's an actual representation of the columns there as they still remain today. So here is my cutaway view of a hypostyle hall featuring these tall central columns that open out into papyrus fronds. Okay, so that represents the papyrus plants along the Nile River, right? As well as the papyrus on the creation myth represented symbolically here. And off to the side you see some lotus bud type columns, again representing that aspect of the Nile River, also the lotus, which also has symbolic meaning in terms of birth and death, but we won't go into that in this lecture. Again, stuck my little guy in here so you can get the idea. These are 60 feet tall. It's estimated that more than 100 people could stand up on top of these capitals, so large are they. Now, one of the interesting features of it is you can just barely see what's called an impost block right here on the top of the capitol, and then the beams of the roof rest on that. The purpose for that is to make the ceiling feel like it's floating over these papyrus plants, so that the heavens floating over the papyrus plants, creates an illusion that the ceiling is not being held up by the plants themselves. Okay, so here you see what has remained of those papyriform columns here at the temple. Now, as I said earlier, you have two different heights of columns, and that's deliberate in order to be able to create what's called a clear story zone. Now, clear story is a word that we'll use later on in Christian architecture as well, where in the great cathedrals of Europe, up above the nave, the central aisle, you've got a row of windows up there just below the roof. That's called the clear story. It allows light into the nave, of course. So here in the hypostyle hall, that's our source of light. No windows down here on the ground floor, but you've got this source of light up here, and there you can see one there that has survived. They're made of stone, like a stone slat screen that allows a certain amount of light to filter through. You can see in my recreation here the light coming through the clear story. So what we're having here, and there you can see it more clearly depicted, with a slightly different form of lotus bud type columns. So these represent lotus stems that are tied in a bundle in the buds up here. So we talked early on in the term about first Egyptian architecture was made of reeds and plant forms, and that was converted into stone forms here for these great temples, and you see it here. Beautifully derived, in my opinion. And again, you get a little bit more light coming through here to show you that the purpose of the hypostyle hall and of the clear story is to suggest the increase in size and light of the cosmos as it's born, right? Of creation as it expands from that initial place of the sanctuary. And over here you can see the scale of these columns with one of my students standing there next to that column. So this represents symbolically the increased size and increased amount of light coming into the hypostyle hall after coming out of the darkness of the sanctuary is intended to represent the growth and expansion of the universe, of the cosmos. And then all these images, the walls and columns are covered with images. Okay, remember the ceiling is painted blue with gold stars representing the heavens. The ground floor is left bare and unadorned, representing the earth. And then, of course, the columns here represent the papyrus plants between heaven and earth. But here on the columns and the walls, they're covered with images. Those images are deliberate. They aren't there just to tell stories and so on, but they are to represent in some indefinable sort of way the growth of life, the microcosm of life on earth itself, coming out of the sanctuary and expanding into the world of life and of the human existence. Then the columns, of course, as I've suggested a couple of times here, representation of the Nile River, reminding people of the importance of the Nile, and the papyrus plants and the lotus plants that grow along the banks of the Nile. So that's represented symbolically here as well. So I hope you get the idea, getting the idea here of how these buildings were more than just a place to go conduct Sunday worship. It wasn't as superficial as that, like we see in our churches today. Now, admittedly, the great cathedrals of Europe go far beyond just a place of worship. And if you ever take my class on the Middle Ages, we'll talk a good deal about Gothic cathedrals and what they meant. It goes far beyond just the superficial of arches and columns and stained glass and so on. But in any case, so here we have all the symbolism that's built into the temple, because the temple is intended to become the new cosmos with each day. And so then after you leave the hypostyle hall, your next stage in the terminal stage of the journey is the open court. And that open court, now you're out in the full daylight. So you start with total darkness in the sanctuary. As you move eastward, you move in toward the hypostyle hall with its larger size and increased light filtering down through the clear story to bring greater light. As you approach the doorway, of course, the light increases. And then as you step out into the open courtyard, you are now bathed in the full sun of the Egyptian day. And so what that represents symbolically here, as we see a representation of it, is the full rebirth of the cosmos. Now, oftentimes when I ask questions about what all this symbolism meant to the Egyptian, to my students for a test, they'll say, well, it represents the rising sun, represents the birth of the day. No, it goes beyond that. It's not just the day, it's the entire cosmos is reborn here in this great expanse of sun-drenched courtyard. So that's what the courtyard was all about. Okay, so now let me just relate another experience that I had when I was on my trip to Egypt. We went to the Temple of Karnak and we were able to tour through it. It was a remarkable experience. Too bad I didn't know more about Egypt in those days, but I was just in my beginning stages of understanding the real nature of Egyptian religion and society and so on, but still an impressive experience. And I would certainly encourage any of you that have the opportunity to visit Egypt to do so. And the best time to do it is while you are a student, because once you get married and have a family, boy, that really restricts your ability to travel, just the expense and finding the time and so on. So if you ever get the opportunity to travel while you're a student to Egypt, I would certainly encourage you to do it. So take that opportunity. It is an experience of a lifetime that you would never forget. In any case, back to my story, we visited Karnak in the evening as the day grew cooler. Gathered outside the great Pylon gates there is a group of tourists, right, led by their guides and so on. Now, the French have put together, at least in those days, they had put together a wonderful light and sound presentation. All tourist stuff, but actually, if you get in the spirit of it, it really kind of sends chills up your spine. In any case, we gather in a group outside the front of the Pylon gates, and then at the appointed time, the light and sound presentation begins. It has, of course, lights that come on dramatically at strategic points and places of the temple as the story is told of the temples of ancient Egypt, okay, and the gods of Egypt that ruled over the land. And so we follow the guide into the open courtyard and gather there in a group and stand and listen to the recording tell us about the stories of the temples and this sort of thing. And at one point, totally serendipitous, but it was almost as though it was scripted, as the narrator was telling us about the gods walking through the temples. In the midst of the courtyard, a dust devil sprang up out of the courtyard, out of the floor of the courtyard, and just moved across the courtyard, almost dancing its way from the center of the court over to the wall where it disappeared. Boy, talk about timing. I don't know how they arranged that, but it was perfect, because just as he was talking about the presence of the gods moving through the temples, this dust devil arose and moved through the courtyard also. Sent a chill up my spine, to tell you the truth. Then after the presentation was mostly over, then they would walk you through the rest of the temple, through the hypostyle hall, back to the sanctuary, the remains of that sanctuary, and there they would take you outside the temple precincts and sit you. Let me show you here an overview of the temple of Amun at Karnak. And so this is the entrance that you go through. Here's the pylon gates. You'd go through the temple, through the hypostyle hall, back into the sanctuary, which would be this area right here. And after the presentation, they'd take you out, and they had some stadium seating out here beside this sacred lake. And they'd finish off their tour there with a discussion of some of the poetry and that sort of thing of ancient Egypt. And then by that time it was about 11 o'clock at night. At 11 o'clock or so, the presentation ends and everybody exits, except my companion and I, who was a teacher of religion at BYU. We were there traveling together. And so we were sitting on the stadium seating, just bleacher seats beside the lake, and just talking about our experiences so far. And we eventually became aware of the fact that everybody was gone, right? All the tourists had left, and they were getting ready to close up the site. Thought, well, we better get going. So we made our way back into the enclosure and down the straight and narrow path through life, right through the hypostyle hall. And again, I remember walking through the temple with nobody around, and there's total darkness, because as we began to enter the hypostyle hall, they turned off the lights. They thought everybody was gone. And so my friend and I were walking through the hypostyle hall, and I just remember walking along and looking up at the night sky. Looking up at the night sky and seeing the stars spangled through that beautiful dark sky. And on each side of us, these huge columns rising up into the dark, and thinking as we walked along there in silence, these were the ribs of the gods rising up into the sky of ancient Egypt. And it was one of those special moments that you sometimes experience when you are visiting some of these ancient sites. You get into the spirit of what it was that these people believed in. And occasionally when you have the opportunity to travel, there are moments when you get away from the hustle and bustle of the city life and of tourists and of all the commotion of the day, and you're alone with your own thoughts, that the significance of history can come tumbling back on you and just overwhelm you with what it meant to be a part of this great story of human life. So I encourage you again, take advantage of these things whenever you have opportunity to do so. You'll never forget them. So back on a more serious note here, sorry for that little outburst of emotion there. But since I'm not standing in front of you in real life, I guess I can wear my heart on my sleeve a little bit here. In any case, here's a model of the temple as it may have looked. There's the lake in the background, the pylon gates leading back into the precincts. Then you had a kind of a secondary entrance that came in this other way with more pylon gates. One of the things about Karnak was it was the greatest temple in all of Egypt, the temple of Amun-Ra, and as such was the one temple that ruled them all, so to speak. And it was huge and wealthy beyond imagination, as I will indicate to you here in just a moment. But in any case, every pharaoh that ruled in Egypt, seemingly, or many of them, wanted to ingratiate themselves to Amun, and so would build additional extensions to the temple, as I'll show you here. So here in this diagram, we can see here's the sanctuary and the first pylon built. Then another pharaoh came along and built another pylon, hypostyle hall, pylon. A passage here, another pylon, hypostyle hall, pylon. And so they kept adding to it to make it greater and greater and greater. This is just to remind you that these would have been the colorful originally. It would have also had the obelisk standing out in front, and then reliefs and colored paintings on the walls. Now, just to give you an idea of the size and importance of Karnak, the temple of Amun-Ra, 81,000 slaves and servants worked with the priests to serve this temple. 81,000 just for the temple population. They owned a herd of 421,000 head of cattle, a wealthy institution, needless to say, and an indication of the power and prestige and wealth of the priesthood in Egypt. And that's going to have an effect upon our study of the era of Amarna, which will come up soon. Now, just to give you an idea of the wealth of this temple and the prestige of it, that is, during the reign of Ramses III, sometime later during the New Kingdom, we have records of the offerings that were brought to this temple. 70,000 pounds of gold in 1 year. 70,000 pounds of gold. 1,956,000 pounds of silver, 4,800,000 pounds of copper, and then untold quantities of oils, wine, fruits, vegetables brought on a yearly basis to this temple. So you can see how, yes, this was truly the greatest temple in Egypt and perhaps in all the world at that time. And you can see how here that the Karnak, the temple of Amun, was the king of them all, to rule all of Egypt with its influence and power. And so we'll end our discussion here and continue with our talk about the Amarna period in our next lecture. So see you then.